Victor Osei was 44 years old, a licensed civil engineer and operations director at a mid-sized infrastructure consulting firm, who had spent 22 years developing the specific, unglamorous expertise of a man who knew how systems failed before they showed it on the surface. He kept a composition notebook, black cover, spiral bound, on his desk at all times, and wrote in it with a ballpoint pen he replaced when it ran out, and not before. He drove a dark gray Audi that was 6 years old. He was not a man who needed anyone to know what he knew. He had spent 2 decades being the person in the room who already knew and chose when to say so. He had been recording site observations at the house on Meridian Drive for 3 months. Not conversations. Structural notes. The crack progression in the foundation wall, the drainage issue in the east yard, the water intrusion pattern in the basement he had been trying to accurately document before deciding on a remediation approach. The recorder was a small digital device he used on job sites. He had left it running on the kitchen counter one morning in late September because he had been documenting the basement and had forgotten it there when he was called upstairs. His wife, Celeste, and her sister had talked in that kitchen for 41 minutes. He found the recording that evening. He listened to it once. Then he sat in the basement of the house on Meridian Drive and did not move for a long time. She had no idea what she had given him. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The basement was damp and quiet. The foundation crack ran diagonal from the northeast corner, 9 inches by his last measurement, 3/16 of a millimeter wider than it had been in July. He had been tracking it for 4 months. He understood exactly what it was doing and what it would require. He sat on the bottom step with the recorder in his hand and the notebook open on his knee, and did not write anything for a long time. He had listened to the 41 minutes from the beginning. He had not stopped it. He had not skipped anything. He had listened the way he listened to everything that mattered, fully, without deciding how to respond until it was complete. What Celeste had said to her sister Pauline across 41 minutes in the kitchen of the house on Meridian Drive was not a single thing. It was a sequence of things, organized in a specific order, with the internal logic of a plan that had been thought about for longer than the conversation lasted. He had listened to the sequence. He had identified its structure. He understood it now the way he understood a stress diagram, not as individual elements, but as a system in which each part was load-bearing. The first thing she had said was the easiest to absorb. She had been with someone else for 7 months. Pauline had already known. The conversation did not treat it as news. The second thing was harder. She had been consulting with an attorney since March. Not to file, yet to build the structure first. The attorney had advised her on the sequence, what to establish before anything was filed, what to move, what to document, and how to create a record that would make her position as strong as possible when the filing came. The third thing was the hardest. It was the word she used when she was explaining to Pauline why the timing had to be specific. She had said, "I need him out of the industry, not just out of the marriage. If he's still working at that level, he has too many resources to fight back." He had listened to those 2 sentences 3 times. He sat in the basement. The foundation crack was in the corner above him. He thought about the 3/16 of a millimeter. He thought about what that number meant in terms of rate and trajectory. He thought about the difference between a crack that was stable and a crack that was progressing, and the specific skill required to know which one you were looking at. He had been sitting on a progressive crack for 7 months and calling it stable. He picked up the pen. He opened the notebook to a fresh page. He wrote the date at the top. He did not write the word angry. He wrote what he had heard, in sequence, as accurately as he could render it. He wrote it the way he wrote site observations, precisely, without editorializing, because the record was the record, and it needed to be accurate to be useful. He wrote for 22 minutes. Then he closed the notebook. He set the recorder beside it. He went upstairs and made dinner. He said hello to Celeste. He asked about her day. He listened to her answer. He did not act differently. He had spent 22 years learning that the first rule of a structural assessment was never to disturb the system before you understood it completely. He would mark that September evening as the night he understood the difference between what he thought the structure was and what the structure actually was. Victor had come to engineering through mathematics. He had been drawn to it at 15 by the specific quality of a problem that had an answer. A real answer. One that could be demonstrated and verified and was either correct or not. He had carried that orientation through his undergraduate degree, his graduate program, his first 10 years in the field, and into the operations role he had held for the past 4 years, which required him to understand not only the engineering problems in front of him, but the organizational and financial systems around them. He drove the Audi because it was safe and reliable, and he had owned it long enough that he knew its behavior in every condition. He kept the composition notebook because the work required a record, and a record required the kind of attention that did not permit shortcuts. He was the kind of man who, when a project's numbers didn't reconcile, sat with the discrepancy until he found the source rather than accepting the nearest explanation that made the problem go away. He had made a certain number of enemies over the years by being this kind of man. He had also built a record that was, in the specific community where his name circulated, considered authoritative. He had met Celeste at 37, at a point in his life when he had been deliberate enough to know what he was looking at when he made a commitment. She ran the communications and public relations practice at a firm that worked with infrastructure and development clients. She was good at building narratives around technical work, at translating what engineers did into language that developers and municipalities could fund and support. He had found that skill interesting, and had found her interesting. He had not examined whether the interest was mutual in the same way. He had, in 5 years of marriage, covered the cost of the house on Meridian Drive almost entirely. Celeste's practice had been building its client base, and her contribution to the household finances had been partial in years 3 and 4. He had not raised this. He had not kept a ledger. He had bought the house and paid for it the way he paid for things, accurately, without drama, on time. He had also, 18 months prior, written a professional recommendation for Celeste's firm when they had pursued a significant municipal contract. He had put his name and his institutional standing on the recommendation. The contract had been won partly on the basis of that recommendation. He had done it because she had asked, and because he had believed in what she was building, and because that was what you did. He had not thought about what it would mean if the relationship's structure changed while his name was still on that document. His colleague at the firm, a woman named Miriam, who was 63 and had been in civil engineering since before Victor was licensed, had said to him once during a technical review of a foundation assessment that Victor had questioned, "You're good because you don't accept the surface reading. You go down to where the load is actually bearing." She had looked at him. "I've always noticed that you do this at work, and then you go home and stop." He had said, "It's different at home." She had said, "The load doesn't care where you are." That was what Celeste had not understood. She had arranged the plan for the man she believed she was dealing with, the man who would accept the surface reading, who would be too measured, too careful, too committed to the appearance of stability to press through to where the load was actually bearing. She had not arranged it for the man who sat in a damp basement for 22 minutes with a notebook and a ballpoint pen. That was what she hadn't understood. Until the September evening she said everything she shouldn't have said in a kitchen where a recorder was still running. Her name was Miriam Asante, the same Miriam from the Foundation Review, his colleague of 14 years, now the firm's senior technical director. The woman who had twice reviewed his work before it went to clients, and each time sent it back with exactly the 3 changes that needed to be made, and no others. She was 63, small and deliberate, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a plain black lanyard. She had been watching certain things from a distance for longer than Victor knew. She came to his office on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the basement. She closed the door. She sat in the chair across from his desk without being asked. She put a folder on the desk. She said, "I need to tell you something I've been thinking about how to say for 2 months." He said, "Tell me." She had been approached in August by a contact she trusted, a retired licensing board member who now did informal industry advisory work, who had asked whether the engineering firm had been aware that a complaint was being prepared. Not filed, prepared. A formal complaint to the state licensing board, alleging professional misconduct in a project assessment Victor had led 18 months prior. The complaint alleged that his assessment had been influenced by a financial relationship with the project's developer. There was no financial relationship. Victor had led the assessment according to standard protocol. The allegation was false. "Who prepared the complaint?" Victor said. Miriam set the folder on the desk and opened it. The licensing board contact had provided one name, not the complainant, which was anonymous in the board's process, but the attorney who had been researching the case history of the specific project and who had requested certain records from the board's public file in June. The attorney's name was on the file request, which was a public document. It was the same attorney Celeste had mentioned on the recording, the one she had been consulting since March. Victor looked at the name on the public document. He looked at the notebook in his hand. He opened it to the page he had written in the basement and set it beside the public document without saying anything. Miriam looked at both. She was quiet for a moment. "That's the same attorney," she said. "Yes," he said. She reached across the desk and refilled his coffee from the carafe he kept on the credenza behind him without asking permission or pausing the conversation. She set the carafe down. "Tell me what was on the recording," she said. He told her. All of it, in sequence. Accurately, it took 9 minutes. When he finished, she said, "The complaint is the mechanism. Without your professional standing," she said, "you have fewer resources to fight the divorce. With a board complaint on your record, even a dismissed one, the firm's clients start asking questions. The projects get reassigned. The standing erodes." She paused. "She's not just trying to leave you. She's trying to unplug you before she leaves." He set the notebook on the desk. He looked at the diagonal crack his mind kept returning to. 3/16. "Progressive, where do we start?" he said. Miriam said, "We start with your attorney, and you give him the recording today." He didn't move fast. He moved in the specific way that structural engineers move when they have identified the crack and know the rate of progression, with the urgency that the rate warrants, and no additional urgency. His attorney was a man named Douglas Webb, a civil and family law practitioner who came recommended by the firm's general counsel and who responded to Victor's call within 90 minutes. Douglas called back at 6:48 the following morning. "I've reviewed everything you sent," he said. "The recording, the licensing board document, the notebook transcription. I want to walk through each piece." The recording was lawfully made. Victor was a resident of the property and had a legitimate purpose for the device's presence. Douglas confirmed admissibility in the jurisdiction within 4 hours of receiving the file. The licensing board complaint had not yet been filed. It was still in preparation. Douglas contacted the board's general counsel to ensure that when the complaint arrived, the board was aware of the prior context. Not to preempt the process, to ensure the process had complete information when it began. The forensic accountant, A woman named Gloria Mensa, retired state revenue examiner, silver hair, reading glasses she wore on a plain silver chain, went through 18 months of joint financial records in 11 days. She found 4 things. The first was $29,700 moved from the joint account to a personal account in Celeste's name across 9 transfers beginning in April. The second was a credit inquiry in Victor's name submitted in July to a lending institution for a purpose he had not authorized. The third was the municipal contract, the one Victor had recommended Celeste's firm for, which was still active, whose ongoing terms included a professional reference clause that named Victor as a supporting credential. The fourth was a draft dissolution agreement for Celeste's practice, dated August, which named a new entity formed by Celeste and Pauline jointly. The new entity had been registered in August, before any divorce filing. She was going to dissolve the practice that held the contract, Gloria said, when she laid the documents in order and reconstitute it under a new entity without your name attached. The contract would have followed her to the new structure. Your recommendation would have remained on the record. Your liability exposure from the professional reference clause would have remained active. But you would have had no claim on the ongoing contract value. Victor looked at the documents spread across the conference table in Douglas's office. He stood over them the way he stood over a completed structural analysis, not reading any single piece, but looking at all of them together, feeling where the load was actually running. The complaint, the financial transfers, the credit inquiry, the practice dissolution, the new entity, the sister. He could see the whole shape of it now, every connection, every line of load running from one element to the next. She said she wanted me out of the industry, he said. He said it without heat. As a technical observation, she built a plan that would have achieved it, Douglas said. Systematically, over 6 to 8 months. He paused. She didn't know about the recording. No, Victor said. She didn't. Gloria refilled his coffee from the thermos he had brought. She set it down without comment. The room was quiet. Victor arrived 22 minutes early to the conference room on the 9th floor of Douglas Webb's offices. He preferred arriving before the room was arranged by anyone else. He set his notebook, a new volume, begun the morning after the basement, on the table in front of his chair, and did not open it. Douglas arrived, then Gloria with her bound report. Then Victor's licensing defense counsel, a woman named Adeze Nwosu, who had 20 years of professional licensing work behind her, and the specific economy of language of someone who had never once had to repeat a point because she had made it correctly the first time. They arranged themselves with the quiet efficiency of a team that had spent 3 weeks preparing for this room. Celeste arrived at 9:08 with Pauline and her attorney, a man named Stephen Park, who had entered the room with the posture of someone who had assessed the settlement landscape and believed the terrain was favorable. He had assessed an incomplete landscape. He did not know about the recording. Celeste had not told him about the recording because she had not known about the recording. The mediator called the session to order. Douglas opened without preamble. Before any discussion of division or settlement, he said, "There are several matters requiring acknowledgement by all parties and their counsel." He placed the first document on the table. A recording exists of a conversation that took place at the marital residence at 4417 Meridian Drive on September 23rd of this year. The recording is 41 minutes in length. It was made on a device lawfully present on the property by a co-owner of that property. It has been reviewed by legal counsel and confirmed admissible in this jurisdiction. He placed the transcript beside the recording certification. Stephen Park looked at Celeste. The look lasted less than a second. But it was long enough. The recording documents a conversation in which the respondent describes, In specific terms, a multi-element plan including the preparation of a professional licensing complaint against the petitioner as a mechanism for reducing his financial standing prior to divorce proceedings, the transfer of marital funds to a personal account, and the reconstitution of a business entity to sever a professional contract from the petitioner's supporting credentials while retaining the contract's ongoing value. Douglas paused. The complaint, the financial transfers, and the business reconstitution are each documented by independent evidence. The recording is corroborating. Gloria placed the bound forensic report on the table. Adese placed the licensing board correspondence. The room went very still. Not the polite stillness of a formal proceeding. The specific stillness of a room in which people have received information that changes the shape of what they thought they were in. Pauline was looking at the table. Celeste was looking at Stephen Park. Stephen Park was reading the transcript with the focused attention of a man who is rapidly recalculating something he had believed was already settled. Douglas said, "We'll allow time for your counsel to review." Victor stood. He set his hand flat on the notebook for a moment, not dramatic, just steady, and then straightened. He picked up the notebook. He buttoned his jacket. He shook Gloria's hand. He shook Adese's hand. He looked at Douglas and gave him the smallest nod. He walked toward the door. He stopped once. He turned. He looked at Celeste, only at her, and he said it the way he said the things that required saying. Quietly, precisely, without any surplus. "You built a plan to take apart everything I'd built," he said. "You built it in the house where the recorder was running. That's a structural error." He walked out without looking back. It did not happen all at once. The licensing complaint was filed 3 weeks after the mediation. It arrived, as planned, through the anonymous process. It was dismissed in 6 weeks, with the board's written finding that the complaint lacked evidentiary foundation, that the assessment in question had been conducted according to standard protocol, and that the prior context documentation provided by the petitioner's defense counsel had been given full consideration. The board's written finding went into Victor's permanent professional record. So did the dismissal. The dissolution of Celeste's practice and the formation of the new entity with Pauline had been enjoined as part of the divorce proceedings, pending the resolution of the professional reference clause and Victor's ongoing exposure under the municipal contract terms. The contract remained associated with the original practice entity until the clause was resolved and his name formally released. It took 4 months. The new entity could not operate under the contract terms until those 4 months were concluded. Pauline, whose name was on the new registration, spent those 4 months waiting for something that could not be delivered on the timeline she had been promised. The $29,700 in transferred funds was returned to the marital estate as part of the settlement. The credit inquiry, submitted in Victor's name without authorization, was investigated by the lending institution and flagged as unauthorized, a matter that did not involve criminal proceedings but that generated a formal record that followed the application's originator. The settlement was finalized in January. It was accurate. Victor retained the house on Meridian Drive, the one whose foundation crack he had been tracking, which he repaired in March with a specialist team, properly sequenced, as he had always intended. The repair cost $18,400. He had the number in his notebook from the initial assessment. It had not changed. Celeste moved into a smaller space. The practice she had wanted to reconstitute was constituted, eventually, smaller, without the municipal contract, without the professional reference that had helped win it. She was carrying the weight of what she had chosen, not with drama, with a daily, precise awareness of the distance between what she had planned and what had arrived. Miriam retired in April, 10 months after the conversation in Victor's office. Victor gave a short speech at the retirement lunch. He said she had taught him that the load doesn't care where you are. He said it directly, without making it into something larger than it was. She had nodded once. She had refilled his coffee one last time from the carafe on the credenza. He hired her as a 2-day-a-week senior consultant. She had said, "I thought you'd never ask." He kept the composition notebook. He was on the 4th volume since September. He answered every call the same day. He walked every site before signing the report. On a clear May morning, 8 months after the basement, Victor stood in the northeast corner of the foundation of the house on Meridian Drive and ran his hand along the repaired wall. The crack was sealed. The repair had been executed correctly. The wall was, by every measurable standard, doing what a wall was supposed to do. He stood there for a moment. He looked at where the crack had been, the diagonal line from corner to corner, 3/16 of a millimeter at its widest progression, running 9 inches through the material. You could still see the faint evidence of where it had been. The repair made the history visible rather than erasing it. He had asked the specialist to do it that way. He had wanted to be able to see where the load had been running. He went upstairs. He filled his thermos. He picked up the notebook from the kitchen counter and clipped the pen to the cover. He had a site visit at 7:30. He had work to do. He went out through the front door, got in the Audi, and drove toward the morning. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.